Hello and welcome. Trade between India and Britain is diminishing, much to the consternation of people in trade and business and economy. But the literature market is thriving. There's a merry import and export of people, ideas, thoughts, culture, all of that happening right beneath our noses. Joining us to talk about that is author and historian William Dalrymple. William, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Good morning, Govind.
So you've written an essay on this subject, and which talks about how and demonstrates how this whole process has been building up slowly, and not many people have been noticing it.
I think the important background is to note how oddly disappointing in literary terms the literary output of the Raj was.
Yes, 350 years and almost
it's this great romantic thing of Britain and India, and in reality it makes astonishingly little impression on English literature during its golden age.
Right.
Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, none of them mention India at all. There are tiny mentions. Indian characters flit in and out of the Moonstone, out of Jane Eyre. There are a couple of Vanity Fair, of course, but I mean, huge swathes of English literature are left untouched. And in a sense, the greatest achievement, I think, of the Raj in literary terms is often travelogues and diaries and histories, things like Emily Eden's Up the Country or Fanny Park's Wanderings of a Pilgrim in Search of a Picturesque. These are great works of English travel writing. But what is odd is how in 1947, if you were to look at that point, here is one of the great movements of human history, one of the great economic facts of the modern world. This extraordinary latching on to India of initially a trading company, and then the British government 200 years later. And it leaves amazingly few ripples on the literary lake, if you like. And then suddenly you have this sort of implosion of empire in the 50s, with lots of Indians going to work in Britain, the birth of a mixed generation. And you get, first of all, writers like Salman Rushdie, sent from Bombay to boarding school in Rugby, then university in Cambridge, and he writes Midnight's Children about India, but in London. V.S. Naipaul, sitting in London, writing all his chain of novels about both the Caribbean and India. Then you get these next generation of mixed race writers like Hanif Qureshi, Rana Das Gupta, Tashani Doshi. There's a whole range of them, and they're producing work that, in a sense, has the two countries mixed in their DNA. Then there's a kind of smaller tribe of people like me, English, British writers going to India to write, people like Patrick French, Chris Bailey.
Both places.
Yeah, and then there's lots of Indian writers who go to London. Pankaj Mishra, for example, lives mainly in London, though writes mainly about India. So if you were to look at the piles of the really good novels and non-fiction written in 300 years of empire, and compared it to the literature that's come out of 60 years of post-colonialism, there's no question that the post-colonial period would enormously overpower the rather slim literature of the Raj.
And even in the post-colonial, it seems to be after 93 or so. I think you've used Vikram Seth's arrival.
Well, I mean, most people would say Midnight's Children in 81, but you could go back to V.S. Naipaul, if you like, even in the 60s and 50s. I mean, it's difficult to chart when they, but I suppose the winning of Midnight's Children in whatever it was, 1981, 1982, when it wins the Booker. After that comes Arundhati Roy, Kiran Desai, Aravind Adiga. Literature shouldn't just be judged in terms of prizes, but they're quite useful benchmarks for seeing what's going on. This year we have Jhumpa Lahiri, and again, her life demonstrates how difficult literature is to pin down within ethnic and national boundaries. She's ethnically Bengali, born in London, educated in New York, writing about Naxalite insurgencies in the 1970s in her latest novel. But most of her work is set in the diaspora in America.
So why is this happening now? Is I guess the logical question.
I mean, these things are difficult to ask why. I mean, why do great artists? Why suddenly does the Renaissance happen in Florence in the late 1300s? Why does suddenly Russia produce great novels in the 19th century? Often, I think it's example. Success breeds success. One person reads another person's work. Just like Beethoven is stimulated by Mozart. I think the success of Naipaul and Rushdie was a huge stimulus and gave confidence to a whole generation of writers. Also, you get this thing where, obviously, the main patron of writing is publishers. Publishers, not governments, provide the cash to write novels. And publishers are, in a sense, like anyone else, they follow success. So if they see that Arundhati Roy has sold 1 million copies of God of Small Things, they send out scouts to India, and next year you have 20 authors being given large advances. Now, those may or may not be any good, but it still provides the opportunity and the chance for them to develop and write at leisure and craft their work. And I think, to a certain extent, after Arundhati Roy, there was this moment when advances were given to any Indian author who had a novel in their bottom drawer was given a great chunk of money. And there was a reaction against that when a lot of these novels weren't up to scratch. So these things go in their waves of plus and minus.
The other, which leads to the other issue of identity, right? So what's the identity of these people who are writing today, and particularly in the area of fiction, right?
Well, I mean, that's the great thing about, I mean, writers are beyond flags. I mean, Arundhati Roy famously describes herself as a sort of a stateless person, although she's an Indian passport holder. Each writer has their own story. I mean, my own story is, born in Scotland, but have lived the last 30 years here and write mainly about this part of the world. I have a trickle of Bengali blood from the 18th century and 19th century, and some more Mughal blood from the 18th century. But my childhood was entirely Scottish, and this now feels like home.
Right, and I guess there is a tendency to ascribe a certain state and a certain identity by readers and maybe external observers, maybe media. And you've touched
I
upon
think
that
again,
in your essays.
Literature is very international. If you're a successful major writer today, writing in English, you would hope to have, a British publisher, an Indian publisher, an American publisher. That these would be exported to Canada, to Australia, and then there's all the translations. So writing is as much as any other business product, if you like, globalized when it's successful. Just like an iPhone will sell in every country in the world, so will a good novel with a bit of luck.
So if let me approach this in two different ways. So first, let me ask you about young writers, right? So should young writers today, someone who wants to follow in your footsteps, for instance, want to be inhabiting these multiple words and developing a sort of multicultural backdrop?
There's no rules to this. I mean, good writing is good writing. It can come from a guy born in a village who's never gone further than the county town.
Right.
It can be a stateless person who, born in one country, goes to university in a third and lives in a fourth. There are no rules about this. Good writing, good music, good playwriting doesn't obey national boundaries or government rules. It's a little sphere of its own. But there are things that governments can do to encourage it. I mean, the British Council does an amazing work, both bringing writers over. I run and I co-run and help co-found the Jaipur Literature Festival, which is now.
I was going to come to that.
Well, that's now the biggest free literary festival in the world. In 10 years, it's grown from 14 people who turned up at my first reading to not 6,000, 250,000, a quarter of a million people last year.
Right.
Since that article was written, it's more than it's doubled and doubled again in those 2 years, and that, for example, would be impossible without the money that the British Council gives us. That equally the US embassy helps us, and there's a whole range of sponsors. DSC, our title sponsor, is a British-based company.
Right.
Then we have a whole range of other sponsors like Tata Steel and so on who help us.
So you, in some ways, answered my second question, right? So one is, how does a writer or a wannabe writer look at opportunities in terms of developing his or her own approach to writing, and the other was, of course, the institutional framework, which you've touched upon.
Well, in terms of institution, the main thing is publishing, and what's been happening very excitingly in Indian publishing is this huge growth of the book market in English. There's always been this enormous market here. Right. A Hindi bestseller or a Bengali bestseller can sell 1 million copies, often with the author's name unknown outside that language ocean. There was a Shankar, the Bengali novelist, said that Charangi sold 1 million copies in Bengali, but he got more press after his English translation came out, and it sold 14,000 copies in English, which is ridiculous and tragic. Obviously, the English language, a wonderful medium in all sorts of ways, is also an imperial medium that is to this day dominating other language groups in the international world. But you have a huge growth in English language publishing in India. When I first came here and wrote, my first Indian book was City of Jinns, published in 1992. It was a bestseller, but a bestseller in those days meant about 4,000 hardback. 9 Lives, which was my most recent bestseller, was published 2 years ago. A bestseller today in India in English means 60,000 copies.
Right.
So we've gone from 4,000 in 1992 to 60,000 in 2012.
Right. So let me complete the circle now. I mean, so we started by talking about, you know, the import-export of literary ideas, products, people, and so on. What's next there? I mean, what do we, I mean... You know.
Well, one institutional block that I would like to maybe err on, because I think it's an important matter, is many countries have cultural visas. Salman Rushdie, for example, is a British author existing in New York on an American cultural visa. He's a great novelist. America realizes he's a huge asset to their literary scene, and they give him a cultural visa. No such institution exists currently between Britain and India. You can't be an Indian author and get a cultural visa in England. You can't be a British author myself, for example. I can't live here on my main trade. I exist here on a journalist visa. Now, I am a journalist. I write a certain number of articles a year, and I'm the New Statesman correspondent. But in reality, I spend more time writing my books and running Jaipur. Both of those fill more of my time than writing articles. I mean, I am a bona fide journalist. I'm not conning anyone, but it would be more accurate to describe myself as an author and be able to be here on a cultural 5-year visa, which is what Rushdie has in New York. And I think if the governments of India and Britain wanted to encourage literature, as well as the existing institutions like the ICCR on the Indian side, the British Council on the British side, to make it easier for artists traveling in both directions to get cultural visas would be the easiest possible way to do that.
Right, William. And what's your next book going to be on?
I'm thinking of taking on a big thing, which is a huge, sweeping cultural history of India.
Right, and
right
going
up
back?
to present. Going right back and right up. So it'll be, I don't know, it may take 10 years, but we'll see.
I know, what's the sweep of?
So it's concentrating, the focus at the moment, I think, I mean, it's very early days, and it will no doubt change a million times and morph into something else before it happens.
Right.
But at the moment, I'm very interested in the institution of the Indian court, these regional courts that exist around the world. Today, modern Indians are brought up to look down on the feudals who you know, raped and pillaged and were debauched and so on. The reality is that those Maharajas, the kings, that right back from Chola period and the Pallava period through the regional courts of the Wadiyas and the Holkars and the Scindias up to the present, have been major patrons of the arts in music, dance, literature, and particularly architecture. And they've also been very specifically regional. The Chola art, you know, is very emphatically Tamil. Right. The art sponsored by the court of Gwalior is very emphatically Central Indian, and doesn't necessarily preempt the nation state of the 20th century and 21st century. So I'm very interested in those issues, and that's what I'm reading up and researching at the moment.
Right, William. All the best for that. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you.